So this is meant to be super informal in keeping with the dev design forum, so you won't be seeing my sort of normal high energy plowing through slides at an incredible rate, super well prepared talk. You'll see my chill self having a discussion talk. So I'll take a deep breath there. So as you know, the topic today is about the new TSC election system. Mostly going to be trying to sort of do a little bit of awareness raising about what it is, why we are making these changes, what the general sort of layout of the new framework is, and then talk about some of the, well, if we have time, we'll talk about some of the issues that we still need to resolve, maybe make some progress in that space and drive towards a resolution off email list threads maybe. But without any further sort of introduction, let's get started. Everything today is going to be driven through this wiki, and that's very intentional because I want people to read it, and it's very deliberately laid out, and all the language is like well thought about and stuff. And so this is, my words mean nothing compared to this. This is like the canon of what's going on here, right? So, yeah. But these words are like, they're all amalgamations of other people's ideas and stuff. But yeah, still lots of my words. So let's start with some history, some background about why we had to solve this problem. As you may know, the TSC originally, as we started OpenDaylight, was formed from Platinum members, and so there wasn't a community to pull people from, so we didn't have experienced people to elect to the TSC, and so we just appointed people from companies, and that was the Platinum member system that we've had for a long time. We started supplementing that with committer-at-large seats. We've had 2 of those for a long time, Ed and Colin, and then we've recently moved to 4. One issue with having committer-at-large seats as well as Platinum members, and we like committer-at-large seats because it's more of a community thing, and we're electing people based on merit and such. But that brought up an issue around a cap of how many people can be on the TSC from the same company. And so when we realized this was a thing, we asked for a waiver from the board to say, effectively, if someone gets elected as a committer-at-large from company X and they have a Platinum member from company X, it doesn't boot the Platinum member. There was a number of reasons for this. One, the people who were thinking about running for committer-at-large seats probably liked the Platinum members and didn't want to boot them because they're actually moderately competent at what they're doing. And 2, there were possibly job repercussions associated with that, and sort of we didn't want to just create that unhealthy situation. So we asked the board repeatedly for a waiver in this regard to not have this cap, and the board approved it the first time we asked for it, and this most recent time we asked for it didn't approve it, correctly probably, because we were effectively bypassing the TSC bylaws by repeatedly doing this. And so they wanted us just to go back and fix the system, properly amend the bylaws or something, so we don't have to repeatedly ask for a waiver. So we went off on the mailing list for a long time and had multi-hundred post threads for months and months about all of these issues, and lots of nuance here, but this is where we've ended up. And so we've essentially redesigned the election system to make it much more like the cow election system of the past, where we have community groups who are getting elected based on sort of representing constituencies, not so much, and probably moving away from Platinum designates. So you could build Platinum designates into the system, but right now no one's talking about that. So we're probably going to be moving away from Platinum designates entirely. So let's talk about the system a little bit as I review my notes to make sure I'm on point. Great, so there's some principles here that aren't really great to talk about in general, but the framework section is what we're going to be going over for the most part. And so the core structure here of the new system is that there's a framework that shouldn't have to change particularly much, that is sort of like the algorithm that we're running through, and then there's the data that I'm calling represented groups that we'll talk a lot more about in a second, that's sort of fed into this algorithm, and that can change per election. And so it gives us a lot of flexibility as far as establishing the sort of general rules of how the election is going to happen in this framework, and then per election, the TSC, the outgoing TSC, can determine sort of the specifics of how we want this election to work, and the second part of it, the data, the represented groups. And so we'll talk about the framework first, and then we'll talk about represented groups. Well, actually, sorry, the opposite order of that. We'll talk about represented groups and then the framework. So represented groups are a set of 4, not a triple, but whatever 4 means, consisting of the list of voters who make up this represented group, right? And so think of represented groups as like a constituency inside of OpenDaylight. So there are people who want certain things from the TSC, and there's other people who want different things from the TSC, and those would be 2 different constituencies, 2 different represented groups. They may have conflicting interests, they may agree sometimes, but we've tried to logically model that in sort of an abstract way as a represented group. And so 4 things define a represented group. The candidates who can run for this represented group seat, the voters who can elect those candidates, vote in this election, and then the minimum and maximum seats that we want to allocate to this represented group. And so the minimum seats is saying, if we want, as an example, someone from the group of support projects, right? So say that's like integration projects and stuff. We want to have at least someone from the support projects on the TSC because that's a healthy TSC. We need that voice there. So we would set our minimum seat value to 1 in this example, right? And that would guarantee that we have at least one person from the support projects who's on the TSC. We could set a maximum value as well if we wanted to and say that no more than, say, 3 people from support projects can be on the TSC, and that would prevent dominance from that constituency. And we'll talk more about max values later and the details of how that resolution system works. So again, that's the 4 parts. So sticking with support, the voters would be like the committers, or PTLs to support projects. The voters would be, or the people who can run would be the PTLs of support projects. The min would be 1, the max would be 3, and you can represent those in integers or percentages. So that's how represented groups work. Any examples, any questions about that? Because it's pretty key. Cool. So once we have this list of represented groups, we can kind of start the election process. And I'm just going to keep my notes up here. Yes? What happens if no one wants to run was the question. So that is a problem, but it is addressed in the wiki here as well. I think how we word it is that the TSC should choose better represented groups or recruit more candidates. If we don't, essentially, if what that situation would be is if people don't self-nominate from that represented group up to the min value that we've established. So probably what the problem might be is that we've set too high of a min, or that we haven't, so maybe this represented group isn't as represented as the TSC thought it should be, or we haven't done enough to sort of advertise that, hey, this is a thing that we really want from you, represented group, please nominate. Good question, Jamo. Okay, great. So once we have these sets of represented groups, we can sort of start the election. And there's an election per represented group. And so when I talk about an election, think of it as a set of elections, one for each represented group. One of the sort of key principles behind all of this is that we want to use good sort of technical voting tools. And so STV, the single transferable vote, is a very modern election system that we won't get into the details of, but it has really nice properties that we will utilize throughout the rest of this. And so we'll run one STV election per represented group. It all starts, of course, with candidates being notified. So we have this list of candidates that's already defined in the represented group. We send out notifications to all of these candidates. We then have a self-nomination phase during which they nominate and provide any bio information required by the TSC. Once the self-nomination phase ends, all the voters in this represented group are given a list of all of the candidates for which they can vote for in this represented group, and they rank the candidates 1 to n. And so this is a first big important difference between STV and other voting systems that you may be familiar with, like first past the post. You're not picking one candidate that you like. You're saying, I like this candidate best, 1. I like this candidate second best, 2, down to n, how many candidates are running. And that provides a lot more information, and it allows us to do essentially instant runoff type. You may be familiar with instant runoff elections. It's sort of an even more powerful thing than instant runoff, and so we can model how elections would have turned out if this candidate was no longer running, for example, and that allows us to drop candidates and do max resolution. So all these properties come about because we do this ranked voting thing. Excuse me. So we've ranked all these voters. All the voters have voted now, and now we need to sort of score the election. And so there's this one mildly mathy concept called a droop quota. Don't get lost on me here. But the droop quota is effectively going to be the number of votes that a candidate needs to get to win a seat. And so because there's more than one seat that they could be running for, it's not like 51% if there was only one seat. If there was only one seat, it'd be 51%. But if there was 2 seats, it'd be 34, for example, and so on. So it's a normal number that makes sense. We calculate this droop quota, and then any candidate who's over the droop quota is declared a winner. They get one of the seats. And let's imagine that there's still other seats available. They're second choice votes. So this candidate has won. They're over the droop quota. Some people voted for them as their second choice, not their first choice when they were doing this, right? Everyone who voted for them as their second choice, or all the second choice votes are distributed proportionally to the other people who voted for them. The second choice votes are distributed proportionally. I feel like that's the most straightforward way of saying it, to the other candidates who have not yet won. They then could be over the droop quota. If so, they're declared a winner. If we're now in a state where no one is over the droop quota, but there are still seats that need to be filled, we drop the lowest ranking candidate, distribute their second choice votes, and you just use those two mechanisms back and forth, either redistributing extra votes or dropping someone and redistributing their votes until all the seats are full. And then we've sort of got our elected officials. At this point, we could be done if we didn't have to deal with max resolution, which is not that complicated, so stick with me for a little bit longer, and we will describe that. So at the end of this process, we may have represented groups who, if you look at the list of candidates for this represented group and you look at the list of winners overall, there may be more people matching the candidate description than allowed, at which point we need to sort of go into this over-max resolution phase. The currently, I guess, fairly widely accepted way that we're going to solve this is a thing I just totally made up based on the properties of STV called over max resolution through scaled popularity. And again, this is relying on the more information that we get from STV to make this work. Basically, the problem is that we can't directly compare winners in different elections because there's different numbers of voters in each of those elections. But the TSC did say that like this represented group has 2 seats of value to us, and this represented group has 1 seat of value to us. And so we're assuming at this point the TSC is doing a good job of allocating sort of representation truthfully. And so if that assumption is true, then it's still reasonable to scale these votes. And so if one represented group had 100 voters in it and one represented group had 1 voter in it, we're still saying that this 1 voter is worth 1 seat and these 100 voters are worth 1 seat. And so if a candidate in this 100 voter group gets 50% of the seats and a candidate in the 1 voter group gets 1 seat, then you've got 100% revolution of the representation versus 50%, they would win. And the same for more normal sized groups. But we scale all the votes for these candidates based on the number of voters in their constituency, and then we run an STV election based on those scaled results, right? So now I'm backing up to make sure because Jamo doesn't look like he's following me, so I'm assuming other people aren't following me. So we're in a situation where there are more candidates for a represented group that have won than can win, so we need to remove some of them. So we do this scaling process to make sure all the votes are comparable to each other for different candidates, and then we take those sort of scaled votes and we do an STV election in the same way we talked about earlier. So we say that the number of seats, which is an input into STV, is going to be the max value for this represented group that we're trying to deal with the over max resolution for. And then we run a normal STV election, and the candidates who lose that election, we're going to go back to the main election, drop them from the main election, rerun the main election, and hopefully by then the sort of termination there should be that we are no longer over max. If we are, we just repeat that until we're no longer over max. Yes, Ed?
So real quick, I just want to make sure I'm understanding correctly. So in the overmax scenario, you're scaling by the min seats assigned to a particular group.
We're scaling by the number of voters in this group. We're saying that,
okay.
Yeah.
That's fine. That's what I had originally thought, and then when you were speaking, I thought you were scaling by the assigned number of seats to a particular group for min.
No, so we would scale by the number of voters. Okay. Yeah. Cool. So max resolution is not that complicated, but it's written very well on the wiki. So I encourage you to, if you didn't follow this, just to go read the couple paragraphs on the wiki. We'll come back to some other max resolution questions in a second. I do want to kind of, we've talked through the whole election. Cool. So let's come back right to max resolution stuff. The three main things that we need to figure out at this point, and I'm moving sort of away from the framework. We've talked about what a represented group is. We've talked about the fundamentals of the framework. Moving into sort of continuing the discussion, maybe making some progress in the discussion phase of the talk. The three things we need to figure out still are election frequency. So this is how frequently we're going to have elections, pretty straightforward. We currently do elections yearly, but there are other alternatives there. And then there's a discussion going on, a sort of more recent discussion around the max value that the cap basically that's defined in a represented group. So each, again, represented group is defined by 4 things: the max, the min, the voters, and the candidates. Whether that max value should be fixed to be equal for all represented groups, or whether you can have different represented groups with different max values. So the original sort of thought here was that, in my head at least, was that the point of having sort of 4 different things is that you can vary them all. But there are good arguments for keeping them the same, where we as a TSC aren't sort of preferencing this one represented group by saying you can have up to a third and this other represented group can only have up to a quarter or whatever. Unless there's good arguments for that, then maybe that's something we'd want to avoid. But that's a discussion that's going on and we can talk more about in a second. And then the third thing we need to figure out is the set of actual represented groups for this election. So those first two things were really about the framework and how we want to build the framework. The third one is something that will always have to be decided at each election, which is what are the set of represented groups that we want to have seats, what are their candidates, their voters, their min and their max. I would now, I think, sort of like to open up for questions, and then maybe we can start trying to have some sort of, I'll try to guide a little bit of a discussion around the two topics that we need to figure out, and we'll see if you guys are up for that or not. Sure, I should at least give some examples of what I mean by represented groups for sure. So if you look at the bit of everything proposal in the represented group section of the wiki, it lists basically every represented group that we've ever talked about. And this isn't sort of a serious proposal. I don't think anyone really thinks we should vote on this one, but it's a list of all the ones that we've ever talked about. So the committer at large represented group is the same thing that we have now with committer at larges. This one, it's important to note that the candidates are all committers and the voters are all committers. Other groups are normally talked about in terms of PTLs, but this one you would, I think, typically have a fairly large min seat value for, and you get lots of committers involved that way. The other represented groups are in a few different families. So you have sort of maturity related represented groups, so core, mature, and incubation projects. You also have kind of where they are in the OpenDaylight stack type represented groups, so kernel, protocol, app, and support. And then you also have kind of the same idea, but maybe a little bit less elegantly put, offset 0, offset 1, offset 2. And then optionally, if you liked platinum members, then you could try to encourage us to go to include a platinum members represented group with a min value other than 0. Okay, and I should also talk about this. I should probably talk about this in the max part, but in order to implement company maxes, which is something that we currently have now, you can do that in this system by defining a represented group that has no min seats, and so we're saying we don't want to allocate any seats to this represented group, but we do want to cap the seats. And so because you don't have a min seat, you don't really need to define voters, but you can define the candidates, which is basically a person matches this description, they are a candidate. And then you can define the max, which is some percentage of TSC seats that can be held. So we'd have a candidate description like person works for company X, and then define that for all companies. And you've got a cap for all companies, basically. And then we can use the same max resolution dynamics I talked about earlier to do company caps as well as other represented group caps. Yeah, so that's sort of the set of all represented groups, Jamo, that we've talked about. The actual proposals typically are something like this. So this one is called all types of mature lifecycle states. And so all types means core, mature, kernel, and protocol. And then mature lifecycle states would not include, types would include protocol, kernel, apps, and stuff. And mature lifecycle states would be core and mature projects, not incubation projects. This one would just also add incubation projects to the list. This one doesn't have life cycles, maturity levels. It just has types, kernels, protocols, apps. So again, and more proposals can be added there easily, but we can figure those out later. The two things that I do want to see is maybe try to drive to some sort of progress, some resolution, maybe a resolution on, are the election frequency, so how frequently we want to hold elections, and this discussion about whether max value should be uniform or not. I don't want to just sort of start off with my opinions, and so maybe we should open up to the floor's opinions about any of this. Maybe I could try to summarize some discussion if no one else is ready to talk.
I have no opinions.
I'm going to stand here for a second.
So in this process, how many times you need to, just a question about the process itself. How many times you need to vote? It's only one time that you vote and everybody resolve.
Yeah, there's only one voting step, and then we can use those same votes for everything else.
Yeah, you vote, and you vote for every person in every election.
For which you're a voter.
For which you are a voter. And that gives, so as input to the system, you have a ordered preference of, I prefer X to Y to Z to W to K. That's another feature we have. So
Can you unmute this mic?
Okay, there we go. So in this system, much like normal single transferable vote, you vote once and you express your ranking for every single election in which you're allowed to vote in, which basically, as input to the system, gives every single person's absolute preference of X over Y over Z over W over K over whatever. And that input can then be used to, the reason why that's useful versus voting for one person is for exactly this reason, which is that you can effectively rerun the election as many times as you want with different permutations of who's existed, who's allowed to get votes, how to reassign votes according to your preferences. And so because you have this extra information beyond like, there's one person I want to see, that enables you to essentially run an arbitrary number of elections in order to try and figure out what the right set of outcomes are. So you can adjust, you can tweak things and rerun it. And that's exactly what the value of single transferable vote comes from.
Can you also unmute this microphone?
Yep, so I just wanted to check in and make sure I'm understanding correctly. Can you guys hear me? Okay, there we go. I just want to make sure I'm understanding correctly. My understanding had been that for a particular represented group, there would be a single transferable vote election for that particular represented group. So if I have, if someone happens to be a voter in RG1 and in RG2, they would be voting in 2 elections.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Just want to make sure I was clear.
Yes.
But at the same time.
Yeah. No, that's cool.
There's only one voting moment when someone needs to vote. We're not going to have multiple times when you need to vote, but you may have to vote in more than one election. Yes.
Okay, that's cool. Just want to make sure I understood.
So question is, are the candidates themselves, are they part of multiple representative groups, or are they committed at large and maybe some particular projects?
Yeah.
And that's how it works?
Right, so there's this, again, a represented group is made up of this description that involves one of the parts of it is the candidates that are eligible. And so that can be just a description for which people either meet or don't meet it. For example, a typical one might be like PTL of support project, or committer to some project, or works for some company, or whatever. Any description that a human could fit or not fit is the description that we would use as this represented group input, yeah.
So the voters themselves, whom will they see as the candidates? Do they see the ones that they are eligible to vote for?
Yes.
Like committed at large plus particular projects? Yeah.
They would get a ballot kind of like the one that's
So
written up here.
there's one election per represented group. So for every represented group for which you are an eligible voter, you will see a different page which has a different list of candidates that you will rank and click submit. So that's from the voter's perspective. For every represented group for which you are an eligible voter, and has a minimum number of seats or more than 0, because you can't. It doesn't make any sense to vote for that. But for everyone that you're a voter, you will see a list of candidates. You'll have to rank them. There's a more nuanced question which I don't know the answer to, which is, are you allowed to be a candidate in every any place where you're eligible, or do you have to pick one or pick some small number?
It's currently written into the framework that you self-nominate for exactly one election.
Okay.
That's right, and that was called out on an email list by someone who I forgot recently. And there isn't like a principled reason for that other than to make my reasoning about the election system easier. I think it's possible to extend it to...
Well, so there is a really good reason, which is that you'd like for somebody's... it's simpler for somebody to be elected to the TSC at behest of one group than it is at behest of like 30% one group, 40% another group, and 30% of a third group. That would be my principled reason behind it. I'm not convinced it's right, but it would certainly be a reasonable principled reason. The second more complicated thing becomes down to when you're a candidate and you're being forced to pick to be a candidate in one election, that's a reasonable decision for something to be made. But when you're talking about like max seats for somebody, if you are a committer of a PTL for a support project, a PTL for a kernel project, and an employee of Brocade, and 3 other things, like making sure that you get all of the different affiliations and represented groups right, and that not only do you understand them, but does everybody else understand them, is not trivial.
Yeah.
It becomes not trivial if we allow people to be in more than one election. I think it is fairly easy in the current limitations because we have, when the candidates self-nominate, they provide a list of represented groups for which they match the candidate description.
But you have to, that has to be audited, right?
Yeah, but that's not hard because there aren't that many candidates who are self-nominating. I mean, like, that doesn't scale to big numbers.
Fair enough.
So basically, you have just as the voters, they can see during the voting, they can see only the candidates or only the elections that they are eligible to vote for. Well, just like that, the candidates themselves. So if a candidate is committed at large, is also PTL for kernel group, is also PTL in some app group, then that particular candidate is eligible to be on all of those particular groups, or
they would have to choose which. Currently, the way it's written, they would have to choose a
they will have to
group
choose
run
one
for.
of them.
Right.
Okay.
And then, I think there's a good valid question. There was two questions. One of them was, is it anonymous? And that brings up visibility. And there's two different directions of visibility, which is who you voted for visible, and the second one is who is on the ballot visible. And I would argue probably no and yes. Which is that I think that voting should be anonymous, and but the people on the ballot should not be.
Yes.
But that's a personal opinion.
I've been working under that assumption without saying it, but yes. Ed, go ahead. You've had your hand up before too, so that's why I'm avidly calling on you.
Yeah. So there is actually one other thing in there, which is are the stats of the election visible? In other words, we don't know who voted for who, but I know that candidate X got 34 votes and candidate Y got blah, blah, blah votes. Do we want to make those level of stats visible? My sense is that given the complexity of the method and the desire for audibility, that we probably want the stats to be visible. But I agree with you, anonymity as to the individuals who voted in what manner.
Yeah, I agree with all of this too. I'll write this into the framework. These questions are very good, by the way. This is the kind of progress I was hoping to make.
I'm just wanting to understand the stats. I mean, I'm not formed an opinion one way or the other. But should the stats really be visible? Because no, I mean, will that affect the legitimacy of a particular candidate being on the?
So I think the question is basically if you won by a landslide versus barely won, is that going to affect your ability?
Yeah.
I mean, you still have one vote on the TSC. So if you squeaked by one vote or you won by a landslide, it's irrelevant. You'll have one vote. And the only thing that I can imagine winning or not winning by a large amount is going to affect is the degree to which people will listen to your opinions. And I think that there is nothing in the known universe we can do to prevent certain people from being more persuasive than others.
Yes.
You can certainly, you can try, but I don't think that's going to radically,
So it's just, it's just that I've not formed an opinion about that.
Okay, what if we were to hold the stats until just before the next election?
Yeah.
So the only thing that would do is mean that you wouldn't be able to audit until after everything that they had been elected to do had been done. It's one of these things where like why does FOIA really suck? FOIA really sucks because all of the people that did the bad things that you found out about are already out of office and the statute of limitations is expired.
Yeah, I think it seems like there's consensus here.
I mean, you could certainly do it. I also don't think, what does it, I was expecting the complaint about stats to be like, it leaks information because I'm pretty sure, having worked at an anonymous anonymous systems in the past. I'm pretty sure that releasing the stats means that I could probably over time guess who voted which way by looking at email lists and +1s on things, but like because by compiling known information, and like I think that's true, but I think that the auditability is worth more than perfect anonymity.
So one more thing, because we have already had committer at large elections in the past. So if we have done it one way, I mean, we probably need to just stick with that. If it was visible during that time, we should stick.
So for what it's worth, the way we did the committer elections, committer at large elections last time was exactly that. Anonymous votes are anonymous. Statistics are visible. Everybody knows who the candidates are. The only interesting exception I'm aware of is that the voting for TSC chair last time was not anonymous. So it is publicly known who voted for which candidates in the TSC chair election, which surprised me. And that was written into the way it was run. It is written. I looked at it and I was like, "Holy shit!" And I went to call Phil, and no, it was written that way. It was intentionally written that way. I don't know if it's a positive thing or a negative thing. I haven't really internalized it. I don't think that but it's now, since it's public, anybody can look at it and say, was Colin mean to the people who didn't vote for him or not? And I think the answer is no. But that's the only exception to that I know of in our voting. It's almost always anonymous who votes for who, and almost always, and the stats are visible. And the stats being visible is just useful to understand that it's real, and you can sort of sanity check things.
I'll just say Colin was mean uniformly.
All right, so the two things I still want to focus us on are the two sort of unanswered parts of the framework, which are frequency and whether max values need to be even between represented groups necessarily or not. So I would direct the floor to throw out opinions in that space.
Why would you make the maxes even?
So the reason that max is even, maybe Ed should articulate it, but I can try. It's effectively that.
So the question was, why would you want to have all the maxes for all represented groups to be even?
Right. Can someone add a mic? Yeah, thanks.
And also, I wanted to say, not as a mic, there is a strip of people in the middle here who tend to TSC on a regular basis. If you are not, the further you get from this strip, the more I'm interested in your opinion.
Yeah, so basically, effectively, there are two ways of looking at the problem with company caps from the outside. One is to say that you're going to cap companies by making, at least my feeling is, if you just single out corporate caps, you're basically saying that what matters is corporate affiliation and not community contribution. Now, when you back up from that, you can say, okay, we do have this general principle of not having any particular group dominate the TSC. And that actually is a very broad principle and one that applies evenly across groups. So if in fact you say, okay, we're going to apply an even percentage cap as a max across groups, that in my mind is in keeping and in alignment with the principle of non-domination. Has nothing to do with your particular employment, happenstance of employment, and has everything to do with saying we have a lot of disparate interests, and we actually quite intentionally try to set up representative groups that are at dynamic tension with one another. And you don't want any one of those groups to dominate. And so what's most in alignment with the principle of non-domination of any particular group is to have a uniform max across all of the groups.
Yeah, that very well articulated side of that argument. Another set of views there are that domination for a represented group can mean different values. And so we may want some companies to, or some represented groups like companies to be capped at a smaller value because that implies domination for that type of group, where other groups may want to cap at higher values because we feel that 50% or 40% or some value of PTLs from X group is a safe thing and a thing that may be more likely to hit versus the same thing for a company. And so I think my initial sort of posts on some email threads were about setting the cap at 100% for non-company represented groups. I no longer think that maybe we should go for a totally uncapped value, a max of 100%, but I still think that they don't necessarily need to be equal. Maybe they should be similar, like 25% and a third, or 33% and a half, or something. But all of that said, I would, I'm not super opinionated about that. Like, I would not be terribly sad if we did set them all to be equal.
So I'll just provide, without taking a strong stance on it, historically speaking, OpenDaylight has suffered from perception, true or not, that we are vendor dominated, and in particular dominated by a small number of vendors, and that has been one of the challenges of sort of getting people to take us seriously, and it's still something that people worry about and people ask about. And if you want, you can ask Neela or somebody else who sort of has, I think, a pretty neutral view on it, but deals with the reality of that on a regular basis. We've also had this concept baked in pretty significantly since the founding of OpenDaylight, and that doesn't make it right. It just makes it, precedent. But for example, the committer at large election actually explicitly states that there can be at most one committer at large, or committer at large has to come from separate and unaffiliated companies. And so this is not, it wouldn't be the first time in OpenDaylight that we've elevated corporate affiliation as is sort of, something which is of larger concern than other elements.
Something of larger concern than individual contribution.
If you have something, go ahead. Yeah. I would also, to your point earlier about sort of where we're placing emphasis, like are we building a system around, pigeonholing people into corporations or pigeonholing them into sort of where they contribute in the community? I would point out that in my opinion, since we're setting this seat value at 0 for companies, that is very directly putting the emphasis on community participation and not company participation, where you are required to be a community member in these certain represented groups to get any attempt at representation.
Fundamentally, what it comes down to is this, right? If you have somebody, and we have lots of somebodies in this community, who have killed themselves, worked 18-hour days for months on end, et cetera, right? And if, in fact, that person comes into an election, and by simple virtue of their corporate affiliation, they get excluded by a cap, that fucking hurts. If, in fact, if you're in fact coming in with a set of equally and uniformly applied non-domination principles, that becomes a moral principle that is not saying, by the happenstance of your employment, we're going to exclude you. It's basically saying, listen, we have a uniform policy around non-domination by any particular group. That, in my mind, feels like a much more morally defensible principle, and much less about being excluded by happenstance.
Yeah, and so I've heard that argument, and I totally respect it. My view of it is that we are setting a uniform thing for all companies, and so I'm ethically okay with setting a uniform cap for companies versus a uniform cap for other represented groups.
The other thing is,
no, I'm not.
What you're saying is that effectively what you're saying, if you set non-uniform things, is that we are setting out in the rules of the election a favoring of greater domination by particular groups than other groups.
Yeah. And I'm okay with that.
Which, in my mind, is just a tweaking the grayscale on the underlying cap problem of saying.
But I think it ignores that companies are in fact a different type of thing than community groups.
But the real question is, this community runs on the people who work 18-hour days for months on end. You really don't want to throw it in their face.
And that's a very emotionally appealing argument. But I think that those people are going to be members of these other community groups as well as their corporate affiliation, right? So, I mean, we're trying to limit corporate affiliation and support community affiliation.
So what Ed is saying is correct, which is that, if you have a company which has more really super dedicated people at it than their cap, some of them are going to lose out. And that's true, and it's unfortunate, and I know at least 2 or 3 people have been bitten by it in the past. In very specific contexts, and I won't go into it without their permission. I've talked to them about this, and I've gotten a variety of different pieces of feedback, which have ranged from being almost as staunch as Ed on this to saying, yeah, it sucks, I got burned, but I think, now that I've wrapped my head around it, I'm actually, I still think that's the right thing to do. And I think it is really a tension between, there are real people that probably will actually get affected by it, and it does suck. And I think a real consideration, which does have implications not just for, our community, but also more broadly around sort of trying to make sure that companies are a different thing than groups, and they do matter more than the groups. And you're not going to get anybody that yells at OpenDaylight and says, "I don't believe it's a real system because the apps dominate everything or the kernel dominates everything." Maybe they should, but it's certainly not anything you're going to run into a problem with optics around. And I hate to be the person talking about optics, but they do matter. So I understand both ends of it. I still think I lean towards thinking companies are fundamentally different. That being said, I'm not. I could be convinced that I'm not so hell-bent on it that I'm not going to say, if you want caps for the representative groups, it's not the end of the world. If I did it, I would make sure that, I think companies are different. They really are. They do affect people differently.
I think we have some.
Yeah, so sorry, I wasn't following this all elaborate discussion, so I need a guide to the perplex. Are we saying that the system that we want to put in place is going to ignore company affiliation?
No. We're saying that we have the flexibility to set cap values for companies differently than cap values for other represented groups. And we could set those values between 0, no members, and no cap at all. And the discussion is more about whether the value, the maximum cap thing for companies should be different than the maximum cap thing for other represented groups, like PTLs of app or kernel projects or whatever.
So
we have enough flexibility in the system to choose this, and we're...
No, I understand that, but given the reasonable size of the TSC, what are reasonable values, or the values are going to be voted in later, or where are you on real values? I understand the theoretical conversation, but sorry, I'm trying to be a little bit more pragmatic here.
Yes.
So I think the real values that have been proposed have typically been around a third, mostly because a third isn't a majority. So less than a majority, I think has really been, and I don't think anybody said it that way, but I think the value which, if you look at the values that come out, it's basically saying we don't want any given representative group to actually have a majority and thus be able to do whatever they want.
Can you say that into the mic or use the mic?
No, I'm saying that the third, so say the TSC is of 9, are you saying company could have 3 seats on the TSC? So I'm saying that potentially could be a blocking vote right there.
Yeah, so I mean, the question I would basically ask is, what is the benefit of having non-uniform cap percentages? I've yet to see any, I've yet to notice any articulated benefits, but there may have been one that I missed.
The thing that, the background in my head about why I favor them is that I think there's more risk from companies as far as actually implementing dominance type strategies than support PTLs implementing dominance type strategies. And I think that, and again, Colin's thing about the optics is an unfortunate but true part that's also playing into that decision.
Yeah,
I had a different question, which is, that's a reason why you want caps for companies. It is not a reason why you don't want the same caps for representative groups. I think my intuition about why that's the case, although it may not pan out, is just because I have a pretty good understanding of why I want caps for companies, and that leads me to believe it's probably worth some of the negative implications that come from it. I'm less convinced, and I do believe there are negative implications that come from caps. And so I'd like to avoid caps if I don't think that they are going to cause problems. And so I do think that I see risks from companies, from not having caps on companies. I don't see the same risk from not having caps on represented groups. And because there are negative externalities from caps, I'd like to avoid them where they're not necessary.
Okay, that's a fair position. Let me describe some of the things that I see that actually make me far more concerned in practical, non-optical terms about represented groups than about companies. Not saying, and this is why I favor uniformity. So for example, we have an intentionally designed system with dynamic tension between the various represented groups. For example, the support group very naturally has a stronger interest in putting stronger requirements on testing, because they're the ones who have to stand there with the testing, and they're also not the ones who have to write the development level tests, nor are they the ones who are writing the code and have to think through the cycles of where the appropriate place for those things are. So you have a dynamic tension of interest there. One could easily imagine a group that becomes dominated by the TSC, by the support group, just as one particular example, tweaking the dial on that set of requirements too hard. Just because from the perspective that you're coming from, that's what makes sense. Likewise, you could imagine in a group that's dominated by kernel, tweaking the dial too hard on things around what happens when things go wrong and downstream has to deal with it. You could imagine, similarly, apps tweaking too hard on nothing ever moving, ever in kernel. And so I see a lot more dynamic tensions between different groups, and I see them actually manifest more in the arguments that I see in the TSC than I see the manifestation of the dynamic tensions between companies.
Right.
And that makes me, from a practical, non-optical point of view, more concerned about not having dominance by a particular represented group than about a particular company. Please note, this is not an argument against companies being maxed either. This is just why I view uniformity as being a good approach.
So I hear that, and I think it's a great argument, but to me that's an argument about having not 100% caps for non-company represented groups, not that they must be equal, right? Because there's still varying risk here, right? There's some risk associated with companies, and there's some risk associated with the scenarios you just talked about.
No, but it is actually, because my position is that the actual practical risks and the actual practical risks that you see in the things that people talk about
are identical for all represented groups, including companies?
are actually more severe for non-corporate represented groups than for represented groups.
So it sounds like you should advocate for company caps being higher than...
No, what I'm actually advocating for is the principle that I think, the moral principle I think that justifies any capping, right, as a purely moral principle is the non-dominance principle. And for me, if you were to make me king for a day and pick the percentage caps, I would feel personally like I were putting my thumb on the scale if I were to do anything but a uniform set of caps.
Yeah.
And that's just my personal feeling about how I would feel.
If I wasn't able to make any sort of argument about one group being more risky than the other, I would feel that way. But since I can make reasoned arguments about that...
No, but see, the thing is, my argument is a moral one, right? It's around the moral principle of non-domination. I'm not trying to fine-tune risks. I'm not trying to fine-tune outcomes. I'm trying to defend a moral principle. And that's sort of exactly what I'm talking about with why I would feel like I would be putting my thumb on the scale if I were to assign, be given fiat to assign non-uniform groups, is I would feel like I had been picking election outcomes.
Isn't that what we're doing when we're picking min seats, though? We're saying we want this number of people from this group and this people from this group. That's very explicitly saying we're putting our thumbs on the scale and forcing at least one person from this group and at least two people from this group.
But if you look at most of the proposals that have come through, right, when you look, for example, across representative groups that represent project groupings, most of the proposals I've seen actually do make a uniform set of choices around groupings. I do not see any proposals that say you should have 4 kernel reps and 1 app rep.
We have at least one which says that there's only 1 incubation and there's 2 of all their life cycle
And there's
steps.
normally more CALs than others.
No, I would agree with you. CALs are somewhat different. And so,
The point is that these are all about... It's getting really hard to argue that uniformity is the answer here. Like, maybe not 100% is the answer
entirely.
here.
I would say that it's actually not getting really hard to argue. What I've expressed to you is that for me personally, if I were making this decision, making a non-uniform max would basically be picking which groups can be more dominant than others, and therefore putting my thumb on the scale about outcomes of elections.
So why aren't you just as opinionated about even min seats?
I am actually of the opinion, and generally speaking, that across kernel, support, blah, 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 what I would personally favor would be an even distribution of seats across those groupings. CAL are a slightly different kind of thing, but if you look at the proposals that I actually am in favor of, it would be something like 2-2-2-2 across the supporting kernel protocols, apps and apps projects. I think CALs are a slightly different creature, but that's more or less the things that I would actually say would feel comfortable to me. I wouldn't feel comfortable personally advocating for 4 kernel seats and 1 app seat.
Yeah, but we might do something like saying 2 to kernels and apps and such, and then 1 to mature and 2 to core as a
So
potential
as I've basically represented before, I don't actually think incubation and mature end up being good dynamic tension groupings.
Right.
but that's a matter of personal opinion.
Yeah.
So I would not advocate for those at all as being represented groups.
What do people that aren't me,
That's-
Daniel, and Ed think?
I'll give the mic to anybody whose name isn't Colin, Daniel, or Ed.
So basically, I have a question about this, the caps for the representative groups. What exactly does that mean? Does that mean the support, say, I'm just picking one thing. Say support has the same number of seats as the protocols, as the apps, as the, I mean, it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be the same number. I mean, I don't see any reason why it should be. I mean, it's something that the TSC probably should think about and decide. Okay, this is the reasonable number for a particular group. This is the reasonable number for other group. Why does it have to be uniform?
Part of the issue is that by setting up what is a group, you also affect what is the outcome, right? Even if you put caps over there. The minute you said all the kernel projects are one group, but let's say we have 80% of the energy over there and only 10% of the energy in support, but I'm going to give the kernel guys only the same level of representation, you also affected the outcome right there without even getting into what is the specific cap I want to put. So all those dials are by themselves problematic. The one that
But we should just
know,
crank up the kernel one in this example, right? Where we'd allocate 4 seats to kernel and 1 to the less important group.
Well, I'm saying that there is, the minute you decided what denominations or what groups are there, you already affected what is the outcome before you even got to the issue of what is the cap per group. And the one thing that I happen to agree with Colin, and I fully apologize for that in advance, is that I think that the employment matters a lot because it's actually part of how this organization runs, and I can easily see that a company has some goals for a given release, and that whether we like it or not, even though as Ed is putting it, and I fully agree with Ed on that one, that we have individuals, and he's one of them, who's putting many hours into this. The end of the day, there is also the employment does affect that. So I feel we need to do caps on employment. The grouping and all of this is complicated.
Yeah, and in general, I agree with Uri. I just wanted to say, similar to Ed, having different dynamic tension groups equally or some form of equally represented across that base of members of the TSC makes a lot of sense. The interesting thing and the reason why for me, and you're right, in a sense that is a cap, right? Because I would suggest that those different groups have some set, this is one of the models, but have some set of participants or members of the TSC that are representing that group. The interesting thing about the companies and why treating them differently as a cap is because you can span across those different represented groups with many that are from the same company. And also, what's different about companies is that you very much get a company bias. People not intentionally, having a feeling about, I want to drive my corporate strategy. Even if you don't, even if you're an individual saying, I'm part of this community, I want to do right by this community, your mindset is such that when you're in a company that believes heavily and deeply in BGP and netconf and thinks that OpenFlow is absolutely wrong, or that IoT is the thing that's going to win and OpenFlow is absolutely wrong, you end up having a mindset that says, well, I need to build this technology that works better with these because this thing isn't really important anyway. And it's not that you want to drive your corporate strategy, you just end up with a bias because that's the way you believe, right? And so that's the thing that I see that's protecting, that's different than the represented groups inside of the organization, right? Support having an attitude about what OpenDaylight should be versus the kernel in an OpenDaylight. It's a different dynamic.
Let's actually take a look though at the things the TSC actually does, right? So all of the things you just described are actually primarily governed by people's willingness to do work, right? It lives outside of anything the TSC actually has any direct influence over, right? Whether or not someone actually goes to work on netconf versus OpenFlow, or whether or not people show up to work on clustering, that's all entirely about people who show up to do work. That has nothing to do with what the TSC does, right? When you look at the things that the TSC actually does, and you look at the stuff on the ground, it tends to be things like, okay, what should the testing requirements be for the next release? Which are fairly agnostic, right? They're mechanical by design, they're mechanical. When you look at things like, okay, great, do we want to go for a longer release or a longer release cycle or a shorter release cycle? Do we want to set our SR in a time frame that's going to be useful for certain downstream projects or not, right? The amount of corporate strategy that actually comes into the things the TSC actually does is relatively limited. Now, the amount of tension between the various groups involved is actually far more in the day-to-day of what the TSC actually does as an organization, right? Because it does set things like, what are your testing requirements going to be for participation? What are the criteria for being counted as a stable feature? What are the timelines going to be for your actual simultaneous release? Because let's face it, for the most part, we help people get along together and collaborate. We help people not step on each other's toes, and we figure out the mechanics of the simultaneous release. We don't make a single decision about the actual underlying technology in the TSC.
No, but we do make decisions about the priority of one project versus the other, upstream versus downstream, and so forth.
What do you mean the priority of one project versus the other? We don't make any calls about the priority of, say, OpenFlow versus netconf in the TSC. Not once.
No, but I mean, I'm talking about, activities that are happening inside of the MDSAL that would affect downstream projects.
Yeah, but even there, we're talking about mechanical things. The TSC never once says, thou shalt go do this, or thou shan't go do that. They say things like, we need to work out as a community guidelines to make sure that people don't get thrashed. So you get things like
right,
weather.
but those guidelines,
you get things like guidelines for how we're going to handle patch reverts in a mechanical sense when people are broken. And those are actually...
What's a blocking bug and what isn't a blocking bug?
We certainly make a decision on what's a blocking bug and what's not a blocking bug. I'm saying because you jump on mic.
And that is something which has,
I have certainly on the TSC expressed opinions about whether a bug is blocking or not, which included as part of it my view of the impact of that bug in that project on the broader OpenDaylight ecosystem, which does include, a personal set of understandings and biases about what OpenDaylight is used for, what our customers use it for, and what, everybody does. And that is not intentionally, but certainly colored by my experiences talking to people, interacting with people, which is based, on, not just my company affiliation, but the projects that I'm interested in, the other standards bodies I work in. And so to say that we don't, as a TSC, ever have influence which is colored by our affiliations, I think is optimistic, but
I would point out that we are also over time.
Well, I mean, the other point I would make to that, and this just may be a difference in perspective, because what I remember about blocking bug decisions are, I remember sitting in the war room during Helium and advocating for bugs for things that I thought were exactly the wrong direction to go, and then fixing the underlying bugs that were blocking those projects. What I remember is spending most of my Saturday mornings helping projects that I thought were absolutely doomed in their misguidedness and get the carafe stuff going. Right? Those are the things that I remember, is places where if I were in any way influenced by my corporate affiliation, I would have turned 180 degrees. But the actual reality of it was that when it came down on the ground, what it was colored by was actually, these are members of the community, and these are people who need assistance, and we all win together.
Yeah.
Ed, you're a good guy. Like what's the two worst case scenarios here? A company dominated TSC, where do we end up there, where they're sabotaging the entire project, or somebody gets their feelings hurt because they missed the cap? Like, that seems like the two worst case scenarios, and should we
I
avoid
think the worst case,
of the
and
worst?
part of it is, and I think this is just difference in perception. For me, worst case scenario, the more likely worst case scenarios are over tweaking issues about testing to the point where you can't get development done, over tweaking sclerosis about what can and can't be done in kernel to the point where you can't make any progress in the infrastructure. And these things get discussed all the time in the TSC. Twice a year we talk about blocking bugs. Twice a year.
But the requirements thing, setting up the requirements for a particular release, won't that also be possibly? I mean, I'm quoting Colin's example where he's saying that he or someone is viewing through the lens of that is accumulated by over a period of time by working in a particular company. Isn't setting the requirements also being colored by that particular lens?
So, but the requirements tend to be mechanical. One of the things we've been excellent about as a TSC is that we set the requirements that we set for the most part, and you're right, blocking bugs is an exception, mechanically. So it becomes not, we're going to pick this project over that project or this technology over that technology. It becomes, you have to have your API freeze at this particular date. There's a process if you're going to violate the API freeze, et cetera, et cetera.
But there are
and
a lot
so
of,
that becomes mechanical.
there's a lot of coloring interpretation to even API-related discussions and stuff. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, but again, what we have is we have a process for dealing with API changes.
And this has been a long-standing discussion around, you've been very vocal on mailing lists about, like, there's this mechanical process for mature projects, and it is exactly what is written in the TSC charter, and I've been more leaning towards interpreting that very, in my mind, inelegant wording more loosely and putting other sensible constraints on things. And so the point is that this is a coloring process. I would like to
Politics is the
have us
natural enemy
move
of code.
towards Phil talking, because he's supposed to be doing closing remarks like 5 minutes ago. But
Okay.
yeah, I mean, we can just keep this going too if it's okay with Phil.
Are there more people? Where is everybody else? There are more people. They're just not coming. So I have a positive thing to say.
So if you have a commit in a mature project in Beryllium, I baked cookies yesterday. The cookies are, Vanessa has them at the front desk thing. She has a list of people who have a commit in a mature project in Beryllium, and she will give you a cookie. And they are official OpenDaylight TSC pound topic cookies, which makes them at least 30% tastier. So as promised, I delivered cookies. So that's my closing remark.
Do we have fresh cookies for the people from non-mature projects?
I think there's peanut butter power bars out there.
Cookie caps must be equal.
So yes, new motivation to get your project to mature, right, is that you get cookies baked by Colin.
Somebody else is baking the next batch of cookies.
And that's okay. I'll bake the next batch of cookies. I would volunteer for that. Well, and at the same time, I'm sorry, I'm going to go back to the topic if you don't mind.
Please do.
While I agree a lot of what the TSC has done to date has been mechanical, I do think that over the next 24 months, we should have new and interesting ground that we're breaking, right? Continuing with the mature discussion, I think, is one that we're continuing to work on, trying to figure out what we're doing with total loss of thought. Trying to figure out what we're doing with stable features is another one, even to the point of talking about upgrades and what that looks like, what we want to do as a community. And these are substantive discussions that do need leadership from the TSC to figure out, and I expect votes to happen there. Moving beyond that, I expect we will get core projects. That's a huge thing, right? When we have a core project, it means they're kind of baked. Their APIs are what they are, and there isn't competing technology in OpenDaylight to go against that. And that's huge, and it also has a company impact as well, which is another reason to make sure that there's always a level playing field across companies. So I don't think it's just mechanical. I think, by our nature as a project, by going, our incubation discussions are pretty much, it's an easy set of hoops to jump through to become an incubation project. We have projects now who understand when they come with a commit or suggestion, similarly, it's, by and large, that's already done, and it's a simple and somewhat mechanical decision for the TSC to make. But I do think there are more substantive decisions that we need to make over time. So it is important. And in my opinion, like I said, I'll say this once and be done. I would expect that we have representative groups that have a number, and so by essence, it is a cap, right? It's both a max and a min. You will have 3 from kernel or offset 0. You will have X number from offset 1 and X number from offset 2. I would suggest either going that way or just having a large cow, right, which is another one of the general methods, and let it just float that way. I could see value in either of those methods of picking. If we do representative groups by offset 0, 1, and 2 or kernel apps protocol, I've been partial to mature projects having some kind of priority over incubation because, again, they're mature, they know what they're supposed to be doing, they've proven that, and so forth. So there's a level of value there in having those projects better represented across those TSC, but I can see an argument against that too, so I'll go either way. But those would be my suggestions as the 2 different methods of using it, and again, why having some level of cap, not necessarily tight, but something, be it 30% or whatever, for companies does make sense.
There we go. So for what it's worth, I'm just going to try and find some consensus here. I think what I hear is a lot of people. What I hear is Ed saying he feels like everything should be equal. A lot of other people saying they feel like companies are different. But I don't hear a lot of people saying mechanically at the end of the day, if you set them all at 33%, I'm going to be upset. And so maybe the right thing, I think as long as we read into the history of it, that, there seems to be a lot of disagreement between whether companies are different from represented groups or not, and sort of how that feels, that my guess is that at the end of the day, if you said a 33% cap on all of the different represented groups, that nobody is going to feel like, they were put in a really nasty position. And so I'd rather not have an ideological war over whether companies are different from other represented groups, and I'd rather have an election.
Saying that I should leave my mace and my luggage.
Where's the ninja shield? But the other but so that's I think that's really what we're coming to. It sounds like there's that. The other thing that we need to think about is sort of which represented groups we would like to have. And again, I'm not, everybody else should express their opinions. I'm pretty good at giving the mic away, I promise. But the only thing we seem disagreeing is whether or not we think we sort of have 3 different bins. We have offsets, we have types, and we have life cycle states. And I think pretty much everybody now agrees that types and offsets are just aliases for each other, more or less. It's not quite true, but that was certainly how they were engineered. It's close enough. So we need one or the other of those. Lifecycle states, the only thing that I would say is that I think there is some dynamic tension there, which is that the TSC gets to, in theory, has the ability to redefine how the lifecycle states work. And I can certainly imagine core projects tweaking lifecycle requirements in a way that would make it harder to become core once they were core. If you want to, it's not any more unrealistic. I think it's no more real or fake than support projects with a tyranny of testing.
Okay. So just one arithmetical comment is that I think the cap has to do with the number of representative groups that are there. So I don't know that the number. So if you have, say, 4 groups and you set the cap at 33, I get that. If you have, so the cap should be somewhat related to the fair representation. It's not just a mechanical number.
Well, so it's entirely possible for me to get hit by a cap related to support groups, even though I'm running for a seat in an application group, which is they're dealing with so the minimum number of seats is about trying to fairly allocate seats among different groups that have tension with each other. The maximum number of seats is an orthogonal thing, trying to make sure that you don't end up accidentally or intentionally with a large number of people who might all vote in a given way. And so I don't think they're related, the number of groups and the percentages.
If you have 4 groups, as an example, if you have 4 groups, then the mean is supposed to guarantee something close to 20-some% for each. The max should not be, say, 40, is my point.
My personal take, although I'd love to entertain other things, is that max is really about keeping majorities from happening, and so it's how much slack do you need away from 51% before you feel comfortable, and I don't know the answer there. And if other people have different views of what caps are supposed to be doing, they should express that. But so far, what I've seen is people are looking to prevent a majority, and they feel like 33% is far enough away. But if that's not far enough away for people, I think that's an interesting discussion to have.
Actually, so I would feel more comfortable with a number like 25, because it's not about majority, it's about the case. Normally, and that is the experience I think we have on the TSC, normally when we do get to a vote, we are very damn close to consensus because everybody has worked hard to get there. But the problem is with all of those rules and everything is not about the normal case, it's about the worst case. And in the worst case, what you have is a very close call. In that close call, 33% is a lot. So that's why I'm saying I think the number should be somewhat smaller.
So this is meant to be super informal in keeping with the dev design forum, so you won't be seeing my sort of normal high energy plowing through slides at an incredible rate, super well prepared talk. You'll see my chill self having a discussion talk. So I'll take a deep breath there. So as you know, the topic today is about the new TSC election system. Mostly going to be trying to sort of do a little bit of awareness raising about what it is, why we are making these changes, what the general sort of layout of the new framework is. And then talk about some of the, if we have time, we'll talk about some of the issues that we still need to resolve, maybe make some progress in that space and drive towards a resolution off email list threads, maybe. But without any further sort of introduction, let's get started. Everything today is going to be driven through this wiki, and that's very intentional because I want people to read it, and it's very deliberately laid out, and all the language is like well thought about and stuff. And so this is, my words mean nothing compared to this. This is like the canon of what's going on here, right? So, yeah. But these words are like, they're all amalgamations of other people's ideas and stuff. But yeah, still lots of my words. So let's start with some history, some background about why we had to solve this problem. As you may know, the TSC originally, as we started OpenDaylight, was formed from Platinum members, and so there wasn't a community to pull people from, so we didn't have experienced people to elect to the TSC, and so we just appointed people from companies, and that was the Platinum member system that we've had for a long time. We started supplementing that with committer-at-large seats. We've had 2 of those for a long time, Ed and Colin, and then we've recently moved to 4. One issue with having committer-at-large seats as well as Platinum members, and we like committer-at-large seats because it's more of a community thing, and we're electing people based on merit and such. But that brought up an issue around a cap of how many people can be on the TSC from the same company. And so when we realized this was a thing, we asked for a waiver from the board to say, effectively, if someone gets elected as a committer-at-large from company X and they have a Platinum member from company X, it doesn't boot the Platinum member. There was a number of reasons for this. One, the people who were thinking about running for committer-at-large seats probably liked the Platinum members and didn't want to boot them because they're actually moderately competent at what they're doing. And 2, there were possibly job repercussions associated with that, and sort of we didn't want to just create that unhealthy situation. So we asked the board repeatedly for a waiver in this regard to not have this cap, and the board approved it the first time we asked for it, and this most recent time we asked for it didn't approve it, correctly probably, because we were effectively bypassing the TSC bylaws by repeatedly doing this. And so they wanted us just to go back and fix the system, properly amend the bylaws or something, so we don't have to repeatedly ask for a waiver. So we went off on the mailing list for a long time and had multi-hundred post threads for months and months about all of these issues, and it lots of nuance here, but this is where we've ended up. And so we've essentially redesigned the election system to make it much more like the cow election system of the past, where we have things from the TSC, and those would be two different constituencies, two different represented groups. They may have conflicting interests, they may agree sometimes, but we've tried to logically model that in sort of an abstract way as a represented group. And so 4 things define a represented group. The candidates who can run for this represented group seat, the voters who can elect those candidates, vote in this election, and then the minimum and maximum seats that we want to allocate to this represented group. And so the minimum seats is saying, if we want, as an example, someone from the group of support projects, right? So say that's like integration projects and stuff. We want to have at least someone from the support projects on the TSC because that's a healthy TSC. We need that voice there. So we would set our minimum seat value to 1 in this example, right? And that would guarantee that we have at least one person from the support projects who's on the TSC. We could set a maximum value as well if we wanted to and say that no more than, say, 3 people from support projects can be on the TSC, and that would prevent dominance from that constituency. And we'll talk more about max values later and the details of how that resolution system works. So again, that's the 4 parts. So sticking with support, the voters would be like the committers, or PTLs to support projects. The voters would be, or the people who can run would be the PTLs of support projects. The min would be 1, the max would be 3, and you can represent those in integers or percentages. So that's how represented groups work. Any examples, any questions about that? Because it's pretty key. Cool. So once we have this list of represented groups, we can kind of start the election process. And I'm just going to keep my notes up here. Yes? What happens if no one wants to run was the question. So that is a problem, but it is addressed in the wiki here as well. I think how we word it is that the TSC should choose better represented groups or recruit more candidates. If we don't, essentially, if what that situation would be is if if people don't self-nominate from that represented group up to the min value that we've established. So probably what the problem might be is that we've set too high of a min, or that we haven't, so maybe this represented group isn't as represented as the TSC thought it should be, or we haven't done enough to sort of advertise that, hey, this is a thing that we really want from you, represented group, please nominate. Good question, Jamo. Okay, great. So once we have these sets of represented groups, we can sort of start the election. And there's an election per represented group. And so when I talk about an election, think of it as a set of elections, one for each represented group. One of the sort of key principles behind all of this is that we want to use good sort of technical voting tools. And so STV, the single transferable vote, is a very modern election system that we won't get into the details of, but it has really nice properties that we will utilize throughout the rest of this. And so we'll run one STV election per represented group. It all starts, of course, with candidates being notified. So we have this list of candidates that's already defined in the represented group. We send out notifications to all of these candidates. We then have a self-nomination phase during which they have community groups who are getting elected based on sort of representing constituencies. Not so much, and probably moving away from platinum doesn't. So you could build platinum doesn't into the system, but right now no one's talking about that. So we're probably going to be moving away from platinum doesn't entirely. So let's talk about the system a little bit as I review my notes to make sure I'm on point. Great. So there's some principles here that aren't really great to talk about in general, but the framework section is what we're going to be going over for the most part. And so the core structure here of the new system is that there's a framework that shouldn't have to change particularly much, that is sort of like the algorithm that we're running through. And then there's the data that I'm calling represented groups that we'll talk a lot more about in a second, that's sort of fed into this algorithm, and that can change per election. And so it gives us a lot of flexibility as far as establishing the sort of general rules of how the election is going to happen in this framework. And then per election, the TSC, the outgoing TSC, can determine sort of the specifics of how we want this election to work. And the second part of it, the data, the represented groups. And so we'll talk about the framework first, and then we'll talk about represented groups. Well, actually, sorry, the opposite order. That was talking about represented groups and then the framework. So the represented groups are a set of 4, not a tuple, but whatever 4 means, consisting of the list of voters who make up this represented group, right? And so think of represented groups as like a constituency inside of OpenDaylight. So there are people who want certain things from the TSC, and there's other people who want different